Clara grabbed Pearl so hard her knuckles turned white. Her little sister screamed into her chest, while the auctioneer called out numbers like they were selling hogs. $20, $25, $30 for the older one alone. Clara's voice tore through the July heat. "Don't touch her. She's 4 years old." The crowd laughed. Then a man at the back reached into his coat and pulled out more silver than Clara had seen in her whole life. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe, and stay with me until the very end. This one will stay with you. The morning they were sold, Clara woke to Pearl's fingers curled around the scrap of fabric she carried everywhere, a piece of their mother's blue dress worn so thin you could see light through it. Pearl's thumb was in her mouth, her breathing slow and trusting, the way only small children breathed when they still believed the world was safe. Clara didn't believe that anymore. The door opened hard. Mrs. Caldwell stood there in her black dress keys rattling on her belt like a jailer. "Up, both of you. Get dressed." Clara didn't ask where they were going. She'd stopped asking questions 2 months ago, the night Mrs. Caldwell slapped her for crying too loud after a nightmare. Questions got you hurt. Silence kept you alive. She helped Pearl sit up, smoothed her tangled yellow hair with her fingers, and buttoned the dress that hung off Pearl's thin shoulders like a sack. Pearl rubbed her eyes. "Clara, where we going?" "Just outside. Stay close to me." "I'm hungry." "I know. Me too." Mrs. Caldwell didn't give them breakfast. She marched them up the stairs and out into a July morning that hit like an open oven door. Dusty Creek, Wyoming territory, a town built on cattle money and broken promises, where the heat in summer could cook an egg on bare wood by noon. The auction platform stood in the center of town. Clara had walked past it dozens of times on errands for Mrs. Caldwell. She'd seen furniture sold there, tools, horses, even a confiscated wagon full of whiskey once. She had never seen children standing on it. But today, there were 2 boys already up there, maybe 11 and 13. Skinny, silent, staring straight ahead, like they'd already left their bodies. A man in a brown vest was talking to a rancher near the steps, pointing at the boys, measuring them with his eyes the way you'd size up a workhorse. Clara's stomach dropped. "Up!" Mrs. Caldwell's hand clamped on Clara's shoulder, pushing her toward the wooden steps. "Move!" Pearl gripped Clara's hand so tight her fingers ached. "I don't want to go up there." "I know, Pearl. Hold on to me. Don't let go." "Promise. Promise." The platform was rough pine splintered and warped from sun. The heat came up through Clara's thin shoes and burned the soles of her feet. Below a crowd was gathering ranchers, miners, women in church dresses, men chewing tobacco and squinting up at them like they were sizing livestock. Clara recognized faces. Mr. Haskell from the feed store, Mrs. Dawson from the boarding house, Pastor Greer standing near the back with his Bible under his arm doing nothing, saying nothing. None of them met her eyes. The auctioneer was a big man with a red face and a voice built for carrying across open land. He stepped up, looked at his paper, and cleared his throat. "All right, folks. 4 county wards available today for indenture or adoption. Let's keep it moving, starting with the boys." The boys went fast. A mine foreman took them both paid cash, led them off the platform without a word. Clara watched them go and wondered if they were brothers, wondered if they'd stay together. Then the auctioneer turned to her and Pearl. "Next up, 2 girls, sisters. The older one's 9, healthy, strong, good for housework, minding children, kitchen duty. The little one's 4, young yet, but she'll grow into usefulness." Usefulness. Like they were tools with legs. Clara lifted her chin and stared straight ahead. Pearl pressed her face into Clara's side, trembling so hard Clara could feel it in her own bones. "Let's start at $15 for the pair." A hand went up, then another. The numbers climbed 18, 20, 22, and with each bid Clara felt another piece of herself being weighed and priced. Then a woman's voice cut through sharp as a blade. $30 for the older girl, just her." Clara turned. Mrs. Dorothy Pike stood near the front, tall, thin, dressed in expensive gray silk, her face pinched like she was perpetually smelling something rotten. She owned the dress shop on Main Street and was known for working her seamstresses 14 hours a day. The auctioneer hesitated. "Ma'am, they're sisters. Selling them as a pair would be—" "I don't need two. The older one's big enough to be useful. The little one's dead weight." Dead weight. Pearl was 4 years old, and this woman called her dead weight. Something cracked open inside Clara. Something that had been held together with spit and willpower since the morning her mother stopped breathing, and the county men came with their papers. "Don't touch her!" Clara's voice ripped across the platform so loud the auctioneer flinched. "She's 4 years old. She's my sister. You can't take her from me." Mrs. Pike's eyes narrowed. "That child doesn't make decisions. She's county property." "She's not property. She's a person. She's 4. "Someone control that girl," Mrs. Pike snapped, turning to Mrs. Caldwell. Mrs. Caldwell stepped forward, reaching for Clara's arm. Clara pulled back, dragging Pearl with her, putting herself between her sister and every hand that reached for them. "Don't touch her." The crowd shifted. A few people murmured. Someone near the back said, "This ain't right, but not loud enough to matter, not loud enough to change anything." Mrs. Pike stepped closer to the platform, her patience gone. "I've made my offer. Either accept it or find someone who'll pay for both. But I won't be paying for a child too small to earn her keep." The auctioneer looked between Clara and Mrs. Pike, his face slick with sweat. The silence stretched, filled only with Pearl's sobbing, small, terrified sounds that no child should ever have to make in front of strangers. Clara felt the ground tilting beneath her, felt the whole world narrowing to this single moment where everything she had left could be ripped away. Then a voice came from the back of the crowd, low, steady like a fence post driven deep into hard ground. "I'll take them both." Every head turned. Clara squinted against the brutal sun and saw a man stepping forward through the crowd. Tall, lean, shoulders built by years of hard work, not show. He wore faded work clothes and a hat pulled low, and he moved with the kind of quiet authority that made people step aside without being asked. When he reached the platform, he stopped and looked up at the auctioneer. "How much for both girls?" The auctioneer blinked. "Well, sir, bidding's at 30 for the one, so for both I'd say 60. 60. The man didn't flinch. He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. He counted silver coins onto the platform edge, each one landing with a clear, deliberate clink. "Cash. Right now." Mrs. Pike sputtered. "This is outrageous. I made my bid first." "You bid on one child, ma'am. I'm buying both." "You can't just—" "I believe I just did." The auctioneer looked at the silver, looked at Mrs. Pike, and made his choice. "Sold to Mr. Calhoun, both girls." Mrs. Pike's face went from red to white. "This isn't over Calhoun." The man didn't even look at her. He climbed the platform steps, 3 long strides, and for the first time, Clara saw his face clearly. Mid-30s, weathered hard by sun and work. Gray-blue eyes that held no warmth but no cruelty either. A jaw set like he'd made a decision and wasn't interested in discussing it. He looked at Clara and Pearl, the way a man looked at something he'd committed to, not with affection, but with resolve. "Come on," he said quietly. He reached down and lifted Pearl before Clara could react. Pearl stiffened, her eyes going wide, a scream building in her throat, but the man held her gently, one arm supporting her weight, the other hand steady on her back. He didn't squeeze, didn't grab, just held her like she was something that could break. Pearl stared at him, mouth open, too shocked to cry. He looked at Clara. "You walking, or you want me to carry you too?" Clara's voice came out small. "Where are you taking us?" "My ranch. Hour north of here." "Why?" "Because that woman wanted to split you up and I didn't care for it." He started down the steps, Pearl still in his arms. "You coming?" Clara looked at the crowd, at Mrs. Caldwell's tight mouth, at Mrs. Pike's fury, at Pastor Greer still standing in the back, still holding his Bible, still doing nothing. Then she looked at this stranger who'd just paid $60 in silver to keep two girls he'd never met together. She followed him down the steps. His wagon was hitched at the edge of the square, a worn flatbed with two horses that looked as no-nonsense as their owner. He set Pearl on the bench, then turned and offered Clara his hand. His palm was rough as tree bark, but steady. She climbed up. He climbed up beside them, took the reins, clicked his tongue. The horses moved forward without fuss, and Dusty Creek began to fall away behind them. Nobody spoke for a long time. Pearl was pressed against Clara's side, still trembling, her face hidden. The man Calhoun just drove his eyes on the road, his jaw working like he was chewing on thoughts he wasn't ready to spit out. The town disappeared. Open country stretched in every direction. Dry grass going gold in the summer heat, clusters of cottonwood along a creek bed, hills rolling toward distant mountains that shimmered like ghosts in the haze. The sun was brutal. Clara could feel sweat running down her back. After maybe 20 minutes, Pearl whispered, "Clara, I'm thirsty." Before Clara could respond, Calhoun reached behind the seat and pulled out a canteen. He held it out without looking at them. Clara hesitated. Then she took it, unscrewed the cap, and helped Pearl drink first. The water was warm, but clean. She took a small sip herself and handed it back. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. That was it. Another 10 minutes of silence. Then Clara couldn't hold it anymore. "Why did you buy us?" Calhoun was quiet so long she thought he was ignoring her. Then he said, "Needed help on the ranch. Lot of work for one man. We're children. Pearl's 4. She can't do ranch work. I know how old she is." "Then why take her?" He glanced at Clara for the first time since they'd left town. Something flickered in those gray-blue eyes. Not warmth exactly, but something close to recognition. "Because you told them not to." Clara didn't know what to say to that. She looked down at Pearl, who had stopped shaking and was now leaning heavily into her side, exhausted from fear. "What's your name?" Clara asked. "Silas Calhoun." "I'm Clara. This is Pearl." "I know," auctioneer said. "Mr. Calhoun." "Silas." "Silas, are you going to hurt us?" He turned and looked at her full on, and his eyes were the steadiest thing she'd ever seen. "No." "How do I know that?" "You don't. Not yet. But I reckon you'll figure it out soon enough." It wasn't a comforting answer, but it was honest. And Clara was learning to value honesty over comfort. The ranch appeared as they crested a low ridge, a single-story log house, a barn that leaned but stood solid, a corral with 4 horses and a handful of cattle grazing beyond the fence, a vegetable garden wilting in the heat, a chicken coop near the back. Everything worn, functional, cared for, without vanity. Silas pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down. He didn't help them this time, just waited while Clara lifted Pearl to the ground and jumped down after her. "House is through there," he said, nodding toward the front door. "Room on the left. Cleared it out this morning. You'll sleep there." Clara stared at him. "You cleared it out this morning?" "Figured I might need it." "You didn't know you were going to buy us?" "No, but I thought about it." He pushed open the door and went inside. Clara took Pearl's hand and followed. The house was plain. Wooden floors, stone fireplace, a table with 2 chairs, a stove with a wash basin. Clean but spare, like someone had stripped away everything that wasn't necessary for survival. The room he'd mentioned was small. A narrow bed with a thin mattress. 1 blanket folded at the foot, a wooden crate turned on its side for storage. "Put your things in the crate," Silas said. Clara almost laughed. "We don't have any things." He looked at her, nodded like that was exactly what he'd expected. "Right. You've got the bed and the blanket. I'll get you more tomorrow." Pearl was standing in the doorway, clutching her scrap of blue fabric, her eyes huge. She looked at the bed, looked at Clara, looked at Silas. "Is this our room?" Pearl whispered. Yeah, Silas said. His voice dropped, went quieter than Clara had heard it yet. It's yours. Pearl walked in slowly, climbed onto the bed, and sat there holding her cloth. She looked around the small space, the crate, the blanket, the window with evening light coming through, and something in her face shifted. Not happiness, not yet, but the absence of fear which might have been close enough. Clara turned to Silas, who was already moving toward the door. Why are you doing this? Really? He stopped. Didn't turn around. His hand rested on the door frame, and Clara saw his knuckles go white for just a second before he spoke. Because someone should. Then he was gone. She heard his boots cross the porch, heard him talking low to the horses outside, heard the sounds of a man going back to his routine like he hadn't just changed 3 lives in a single afternoon. Clara looked at Pearl on the bed. Pearl looked back at her with those big brown eyes. Is he a good man, Clara? Clara thought about the way he'd held Pearl on the platform, gentle, careful. The way he'd handed over the canteen without making a show of it. The way he'd paid $60 to keep them together when every other person in that crowd had looked away. She thought about the door to their room. No lock on it. Not on the inside, not on the outside. I think he might be, Clara said slowly. But we watch, we pay attention, and we stay together no matter what. Pearl nodded and curled up on the bed, the blue cloth pressed to her cheek. Clara. Yeah. My feet don't burn here. Clara sat down beside her sister and pulled the blanket up. Pearl's breathing slowed, softened, steadied. Outside the sun was going down and the heat was finally breaking, and from somewhere near the barn came the sound of Silas splitting wood, steady, rhythmic. The sound of a man who knew how to work and didn't need an audience for it. Clara lay back and stared at the ceiling. This morning, she'd been standing on an auction block, certain she was about to lose the only person left in the world who loved her. Now she was in a strange man's house, in a room he'd cleared out on the chance he might bring them home, wearing a dress too big for her, with nothing to her name but her sister and her fear. She didn't trust it, not yet. But when Silas knocked on the doorframe an hour later and said, "Supper's ready, beans and cornbread, nothing fancy," and set 2 plates on the table and took his own plate outside to eat on the porch so they could have the space to themselves, Clara felt something she hadn't felt since her mother died. She felt like maybe, just maybe, she'd landed somewhere that wouldn't break her. Pearl ate like she hadn't seen food in days, which wasn't far from the truth. Clara ate slowly, watching the door, listening to Silas's boots on the porch, the creak of the step as he sat down. When they finished, Clara carried the plates outside. Silas was sitting on the top step, his plate empty, staring out at the darkening hills. He didn't turn when she came out. "Thank you for the food," Clara said. He took the plates from her hands. "You know how to wash dishes?" "Yes." "Good. Basin's inside. Water's there. Don't use the axe in the barn unless I'm around." "Yes, sir." He glanced at her. "You don't have to call me sir. Silas is fine." "Okay, Silas." He stood, dusted off his pants. "Chores start at dawn. Chickens, eggs, water. Nothing heavy. Pearl can help where she's able, but I don't expect much from her." "She'll try. She always tries." Something crossed his face, a shadow there and gone. "I'm sure she does." He picked up his hat. "I'll be in the barn. Don't wander after dark. Coyotes come close sometimes, and the ground's rough if you don't know it." He walked away, and the darkness swallowed him before he reached the barn door. Clara stood on that porch and listened to the night. Crickets. A breeze through dry grass. The soft sound of horses shifting in the corral. No shouting, no Mrs. Caldwell, no cold hands grabbing her arm, just quiet. She went inside, washed the dishes by the light of a single lamp, and lay down next to Pearl. The mattress was thin. The blanket was rough, but the room was theirs, and the door had no lock, and somewhere outside, a man who'd paid $60 to keep them together was sleeping in a barn because he wanted them to feel safe. Pearl shifted in her sleep, her small fist curling around Clara's finger. "Mama," Pearl murmured, still dreaming. Clara closed her eyes and held on tight. For the first time in 2 months, she didn't dream about the auction block. She dreamed about her mother's hands, sewing, always sewing, and the sound of her voice saying, "Take care of your sister Clara. Promise me." "I promise, Mama," Clara whispered into the dark. And somewhere in the barn, in the glow of a single lantern, Silas Calhoun sat on a hay bale and stared at the small wooden cradle he'd built 4 years ago for a son who never drew breath. He hadn't touched it since the day he put it in the corner and covered it with a horse blanket. Tonight he reached out and ran his rough hand along the smooth rail. Then he pulled back, turned out the lantern, and lay down in the dark. 2 girls sleeping in his house. 2 lives he'd bought with silver, and a decision he couldn't fully explain even to himself. He closed his eyes. The summer night settled over the ranch hot, still full of stars, and 3 people who had each lost everything they loved slept under the same roof for the first time, not knowing yet that what they'd lost was about to be found again in the last place any of them expected. Dawn came with a knock. 3 sharp raps on the doorframe, and Clara's eyes flew open. Pearl was still curled against her, the blue cloth pressed to her cheek, breathing soft and steady. "Up!" Silas called from the other side. "Chores don't wait for sleep." Clara, dressed fast, helped Pearl into her oversized dress and came out to find Silas at the stove. He didn't turn around. 2 cups of milk sat on the table, and the smell of frying eggs filled the room. "Drink that, then outside." Pearl climbed onto the chair and wrapped both hands around her cup. She drank slowly, watching Silas's back with the careful attention of a child who'd learned to read adults for danger. Silas divided eggs onto 3 plates, set 2 on the table, took his to the porch, same as last night, giving them space without being asked. Clara ate fast. Pearl ate faster. When they finished, Clara carried the plates to the basin and followed Silas outside into the early morning heat. He was already halfway to the chicken coop, a small bucket in his hand. He held it out to Clara without breaking stride. "Feed's in the barn. 1 scoop per bird. Scatter it wide so they don't fight over it." "How many chickens?" 12. "You'll count them every morning. If the number changes, you tell me." "What if one's missing?" "Then something got it, and we need to know what." Clara took the bucket. Pearl was standing close, one hand gripping Clara's skirt, the other holding her cloth. Silas looked down at Pearl. He crouched slow and deliberate until he was at her level. His voice dropped to something Clara hadn't heard from him before, not soft exactly, but careful, like he was handling something fragile. "You like chickens, Pearl?" Pearl nodded shy. "Good. You help your sister feed them. But don't chase them. They spook, and then they don't lay right for 2 days. I won't chase them." "All right then." He stood and walked toward the barn. Clara watched him go, trying to read the way he moved. No hesitation, no wasted motion, but something underneath it. Something heavy he carried in his shoulders. They found the feed where he said it would be. Clara scooped and scattered, showing Pearl how to spread it so the chickens didn't crowd. Pearl laughed when a fat red hen pecked grain right off her shoe. That laugh, bright and sudden in the quiet morning, did something to Clara's chest. Loosened a knot she hadn't known was there. Silas came back carrying a toolbox. He glanced at their work and nodded once. "Good. Now come with me." They spent the morning at the corral fence. A section had pulled loose from the posts, and Silas worked it with steady hands, showing Clara how to hold the boards while he hammered. Pearl sat in the dirt nearby, arranging rocks into patterns and having conversations with a beetle she'd found. Clara held the board and watched Silas's hands. They were scarred across the knuckles, calloused thick as leather. Hands that had done hard work for years. "How long you been out here?" she asked. "This ranch, 4 years. "Where were you before?" "Army. Scouted for the cavalry out of Fort Laramie." "Why'd you leave?" His hammer paused mid-swing. Just a beat. Then it came down hard and clean. Had my reasons. Clara knew a closed door when she heard one. She held the next board without asking. They worked until the sun pushed straight overhead, and the heat became something you could taste dust and dry grass and the metal tang of sweat. Silas called a stop, and they sat in the shade against the barn, sharing the canteen. Pearl had fallen asleep in the grass, her rock collection scattered around her, the beetle long gone. Silas tipped his hat down over his eyes. For a while the only sound was their breathing and the buzz of insects. "Your mother," he said. "What happened to her?" Clara stiffened. "Consumption, 6 months ago." "And your father?" "Mine collapse, 2 years before that." Silas nodded slowly. "Sorry." "Everybody's sorry. Nobody does anything about it." "I did." Clara looked at him. His hat was still low, his face hidden, but she heard something in those 2 words that wasn't pride. It was fact. Flat and simple and true. "Yeah," she said quietly. "You did." He pushed his hat back and looked at her. "Your mother teach you anything, reading, sewing, that kind of thing?" "She taught me to read. Started teaching me sewing before she got sick." "School. 2 years at the Dusty Creek schoolhouse. Mrs. Caldwell pulled me out when we went to her facility. Said schooling was a waste for orphans." Something moved in Silas's jaw, a muscle ticking. "That's so." "She said our job was to learn to be useful." "Useful?" He said the word like it tasted bad. "You're 9 years old." She didn't care about that. Silas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "There's a school in town. When things settle, we'll figure out how to get you there." Clara stared at him. "You'd let me go to school?" "Why wouldn't I?" "Because you bought us to work." He turned and looked at her full on. Those gray-blue eyes held something Clara couldn't name, not anger, not pity. Something deeper. "I bought you so that woman wouldn't split you apart. The work's just what keeps us going. You're smart enough to need school, so you'll get school." Clara opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came. She looked down at her hands, dirty, scraped the fingernails torn short from holding fence boards. 9 years old, and already hands like a laborer. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me. Just do the work and learn what you can." That afternoon, Silas sent Clara to the barn for a saddle blanket he needed. She found it on a shelf near the back, but as she pulled it down, something caught her eye. A wooden cradle sitting in the corner, half covered by a horse blanket. Clara stopped. The cradle was beautiful smooth pine, carefully shaped with rails, sanded down so there were no rough edges. It had been made by someone who cared about every detail, someone who wanted it perfect. She reached out and touched the rail. The wood was cool under her fingers. "Don't touch that." Silas's voice came from the barn door, sharp enough to cut. Clara jerked her hand back and spun around. He was standing in the doorway, his body rigid, his face harder than she'd seen it. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean. Just leave it alone." He crossed the barn in 3 strides, grabbed the saddle blanket from where she'd dropped it, and walked out without another word. Clara stood there, her heart hammering, staring at the cradle. She didn't ask about it. But that night, while Pearl slept, and Clara lay awake listening to the ranch sounds, crickets, horses, the creak of wood cooling in the night air, she understood something about Silas Calhoun that she hadn't before. He'd lost someone small. The second day set the pattern. Up before dawn. Chores. Breakfast eaten mostly in silence. More work hauling water, pulling weeds in the garden, learning which eggs to gather and which to leave. Pearl followed Clara everywhere, chattering to the chickens, naming the horses, slowly building a world of small wonders out of the ranch's ordinary rhythms. By the 3rd day, Pearl had named every chicken. "That one's Biscuit," she told Silas at supper, pointing out the window toward the coop. "The fat one's Gravy, and the mean one that pecks is Mrs. Caldwell." Clara froze. Silas looked at Pearl for a long beat, his face unreadable. Then the corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile, but close. Mrs. Caldwell, he repeated. She's mean, Pearl said matter-of-factly. Reckon she is. That almost smile stayed with Clara long after supper was done. It was the first crack she'd seen in the wall Silas kept around himself, and it came from Pearl 4 years old naming chickens after the woman who'd sold them like cattle. On the fourth morning, Clara was hanging wash on the line when she heard Pearl scream. Not a startled scream, not a playing scream, a scream that turned Clara's blood to ice water. She dropped the shirt she was holding and ran. Pearl was near the garden, standing rigid, her face white, staring at her right hand. A thin red line ran across her fingers, and on the ground near her feet, a small brown snake was coiling back into the weeds. "Pearl!" Clara grabbed her sister and pulled her back. Pearl was shaking, tears streaming, holding her hand out like it was on fire. "It bit me, Clara! It bit me!" Clara's mind went blank with terror. She didn't know snakes, didn't know which ones killed and which ones didn't. All she knew was that Pearl was 4 years old and something had put its teeth in her. "Silas!" Her voice tore across the ranch. She heard a crash from inside the barn, something dropped, and then boots fast pounding dirt. Silas came around the corner at a dead run, and Clara had never seen him move like that. 3 days of slow, deliberate steadiness gone in an instant. What happened? Snake bit her, her hand. I don't know what kind. Silas knelt and took Pearl's hand. His fingers were gentle but fast, turning her wrist, examining the marks. Pearl was sobbing, hiccuping, her whole body trembling. "Where's the snake?" "Went into the weeds. Brown, small." Silas looked at the marks again. 2 tiny punctures barely bleeding. He let out a breath, slow, controlled, and his shoulders dropped 1/2 an inch. "Bull snake," he said. "Not venomous. She'll be fine." Clara's legs nearly gave out. "You're sure?" "I'm sure. Hurts like the devil, but it won't kill her." He looked at Pearl, who was still crying. "Hey, Pearl, look at me." Pearl looked at him through her tears. "You're tough, right?" Pearl's chin trembled. "It hurts." "I know it does, but you know what, that snake's more scared of you than you are of it." "That's not true." "It is. You're bigger than him. He bit you because you scared him." "I didn't mean to." "I know. Come on." He stood and lifted her smooth, easy, like he'd been picking up small children his whole life. "Let's wash that hand and put something on it." He carried Pearl inside, sat her on the table, and cleaned the bite with water and a dab of carbolic salve. Clara watched his hands, those scarred, rough hands, move over Pearl's tiny fingers, with a care that made her throat ache. Pearl sniffled. "Am I gonna die?" "No, ma'am. Not from a bull snake." "Promise." Silas paused. His eyes met Pearl's, and something passed between them, something Clara couldn't quite catch but felt in her chest. "Promise," he said. Pearl held up her bandaged hand and studied it. "Can I still feed the chickens?" "Tomorrow. Today you rest." "But Biscuit will miss me." The almost smile came back. "Biscuit will survive." That evening Silas carved something at the kitchen table while Clara washed dishes. She could hear his knife working small, precise strokes. When she turned around, he set a tiny wooden horse on the table and pushed it toward the bedroom where Pearl was lying down. "For her," he said. "Might take her mind off the hand." Clara picked it up. It was rough but recognizable, 4 legs, a mane, a tail. Made in an hour by a man whose hands were better suited to fence posts and bridle leather. "She'll love it," Clara said. "It's just wood." "It's not just wood." He looked at her, and for a second, the wall cracked again. Then he stood and went outside, and Clara heard him settle onto the porch steps, the way he did every night alone, staring at the hills, keeping whatever he carried locked up tight. She brought the horse to Pearl, who clutched it to her chest alongside the blue cloth and fell asleep smiling. On the 5th day, a rider appeared on the south road. Clara saw him first, a stocky man on a brown horse moving at an easy pace. No rush, but no hesitation. She was gathering eggs and her hands tightened on the basket. Silas came out of the barn, saw the rider, and went still. "Go inside," he said to Clara. "Take Pearl." "Who is it?" "Neighbor. Tobias Marsh. Go inside." Clara gathered Pearl and went, but she watched from the window. The rider Marsh dismounted and walked up to Silas with the loose-hipped gait of a man comfortable on his own land, but wary on someone else's. "Silas?" "Toby." The two men stood about 6 feet apart, sizing each other up. Marsh was shorter than Silas, but broader, with sun-cracked skin and a thick mustache going gray at the edges. "Heard you bought yourself some children at the auction." "News travels." "It does when it's that kind of news." Marsh glanced toward the house. "2 girls, they're saying. Sisters." "That's right." "Mind telling me why a man living alone buys 2 young girls?" Silas's voice went flat and cold. "Mind telling me why that's your business?" "I've got a ranch 3 miles south. Wife and 3 boys. We're neighbors, Silas. If something's not right over here, it concerns me." "Something's not right." "Say what you mean, Toby." Marsh shifted his weight. "People talk. A single man, no family buying girls at auction. You know how that looks." Silas stepped forward. 1 step. Not aggressive, but the space between them shrank, and Marsh felt it. Clara could see it from the window, the way Marsh's shoulders pulled back, the way his hand drifted toward his belt. "I'll tell you how it looks," Silas said, his voice low and steady. "It looks like 2 kids were about to get torn apart and sold to separate owners, and I was the only one in that crowd who gave enough of a damn to stop it." "That may be." "That is, you want to come in my house, look around, see the room where they sleep, doors open, no locks on it. I eat on the porch so they feel safe. The older one does chores because she wants to help, not because I force her. The little one names chickens and plays with rocks. That's what's happening here, Toby. Nothing more." Marsh was quiet for a long time. He looked at the house at the chicken coop, where Pearl's handprints were still in the dust near the gate at the garden, where Clara had been pulling weeds that morning. "Ruth wants to come by," he said finally. "My wife wants to meet the girls. She's welcome any time. She'll bring some things, clothes probably. She's been on about it since she heard." Silas nodded. "Appreciate it." Marsh put his foot in the stirrup and swung up onto his horse. He looked down at Silas from the saddle, his expression hard to read. "For what it's worth, I hope you're telling the truth." "I don't lie, Toby. Never had the talent for it." Marsh grunted, turned his horse, and rode south. Silas watched him go, standing motionless, until the rider was just a dot against the brown hills. Then he walked to the porch, sat on the top step, and put his face in his hands. Just for a moment. Just long enough for Clara to see his shoulders shake once. Then he straightened up, put his hat back on, and went back to work. Clara came outside slowly. "He thinks you're hurting us. He thinks what the town thinks. But you're not. Doesn't matter what I do. Matters what they believe." "That's not fair." Silas looked at her. "You're 9 years old, and you've been sold on an auction block. You already know life isn't fair." Clara didn't argue. He was right. 2 days later, Ruth Marsh came. She arrived mid-morning on a gentle mare saddlebags, stuffed so full they bulged. She was a solid woman with kind eyes and hands that looked like they'd kneaded 1,000 loaves of bread. She dismounted with practiced ease and smiled at Clara, who was standing by the garden holding a hoe she was still learning to use. "You must be Clara." "Yes, ma'am." "I'm Ruth, Toby's wife." She pulled a bundle from the saddlebag. "Brought some things. Got 3 boys and no girls, so I've been collecting dresses and such for years with nobody to give them to." Clara didn't know what to say. Nobody had given her anything in months. The last gift she'd received was a ribbon from her mother the week before she died. Ruth didn't wait for a response. She walked right up to the house, knocked on the open door, and called inside. "Mr. Calhoun, it's Ruth Marsh." Silas appeared in the doorway, a cup of coffee in his hand. "Ma'am?" "I've brought clothes for the girls, and some preserves. And a pie because you look like you haven't eaten anything that wasn't beans or cornbread in 4 years." Silas blinked. Clara had never seen him caught off guard before. That's kind of you. It's practical. Growing girls need proper clothes and you need pie. She was already inside setting bundles on the table, her energy filling the small house like sunlight through a window thrown open. Where's the little one? Out back. Pearl. Pearl came running at Clara's call, her wooden horse clutched in one fist, her cloth in the other. She stopped dead when she saw Ruth pressing against Clara's leg. Ruth crouched down and her face changed. The brisk energy softened into something warm and aching. Hello, sweetheart. I'm Mrs. Marsh. You can call me Ruth if you like. Pearl stared at her, then looked up at Clara. It's okay, Clara said. Pearl looked back at Ruth. Do you have chickens? Ruth laughed a real laugh, full and warm. I surely do. About 30 of them. Do they have names? They do now that you've given me the idea. Pearl smiled. Just a small one barely there, but Ruth saw it, and Clara saw Ruth's eyes go bright. Ruth stayed most of the morning. She helped Clara try on the dresses, 3 of them worn but clean close enough to fitting. She braided Pearl's hair with a practiced hand and tied it with a yellow ribbon that Pearl touched like it was made of gold. She didn't ask about the auction, didn't ask about Mrs. Caldwell, didn't pry or push or prod. She just moved through the house doing things, straightening, organizing, showing Clara how to store the preserves, explaining which herbs grew wild nearby and what they were good for. Silas stayed outside the whole time working on something near the barn, giving them space. But Clara saw him glance toward the house more than once, and each time his face held that expression she was learning to recognize, not quite relief, not quite gratitude. Something between the two that he didn't have words for. Before Ruth left, she stood on the porch with Silas while Clara helped Pearl arrange her new dresses in the wooden crate. Those girls are thin, Ruth said, her voice low, but Clara could hear it through the window. I'm feeding them. I know you are, but they've been underfed for months. You can see it in their faces, the little one especially. I'll fix it. I'll help. I'll come by twice a week, bring food work with Clara on cooking and sewing. She needs that. Silas was quiet. Then he said, The county's been asking about female influence. Having you come by would help with that. I'm not doing it for the county, Silas. I'm doing it for them. Ruth paused. And for you. You're doing a good thing here, even if you can't see it yet. Toby doesn't think so. Toby came home and told me what you said. About eating on the porch, about the door with no lock. She touched his arm briefly. He's coming around. Give him time. Silas nodded, and Ruth mounted her horse and rode away. He stood on the porch watching her go, and when she was out of sight, he turned and found Clara standing in the doorway. She's nice, Clara said. She is. Is she going to report us to the county? Silas shook his head. She's going to help us. There's a difference. I'm having trouble telling the difference these days. He looked at her, and for a long moment they just stood there, a man and a girl, both of them damaged, both of them trying to figure out if trust was a gift or a trap. Fair enough, Silas said. You'll learn. That night, after Pearl was asleep, Clara sat on the porch steps. Silas was there whittling. The silence was different now, not empty, but full. Full of things they were both too tired and too careful to say. Silas, yeah. That cradle in the barn, it was for your baby, wasn't it? His knife stopped. The night sounds filled the gap. Crickets, wind, a horse stamping in the corral. Yeah, he said finally. It was. What happened? My wife Mary died in childbirth. Baby boy didn't make it either. Thomas. We were going to call him Thomas. Clara's chest tightened so hard she couldn't breathe for a second. I'm sorry. 4 years ago, last April. Built that cradle the month before. Sanded it 3 times to make sure there were no splinters. His voice was flat, but his hands gripped the wood he was carving hard enough to whiten his knuckles. Never got used. Is that why you live out here alone? Wasn't much reason to be around people after that. And now, he looked at her. In the lamplight, his eyes were darker than usual, the gray-blue gone to shadow. Now I've got 2 girls sleeping in my house who need me to keep going, so I keep going. Is that enough? Just keeping going? Silas was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was rough, like the words were being pulled out of somewhere deep. It's more than I had last week. Clara nodded. She understood that. Sometimes survival wasn't about finding something good. It was about finding something less empty. She stood. Good night, Silas. Night, Clara. She went inside and lay down next to Pearl. Through the thin wall, she could hear Silas on the porch, the scrape of his knife, the soft fall of wood shavings. Still working, still carving, still turning raw material into something shaped and purposeful, the way he was trying to turn this broken arrangement into something that worked. Pearl stirred and mumbled, "Clara, is the snake gonna come back?" "No, honey. Silas said it's more scared of you than you are of it." Pearl thought about that. Good. She paused. Clara. Yeah. I like it here. My tummy's full, and nobody yells. Clara pulled her sister close and pressed her face into Pearl's hair. I like it here too. Is Silas our family now? I don't know yet. I think he is. He made me a horse, and he promised I wouldn't die. Clara smiled into the dark. 4 years old, and that was enough, a wooden horse and a promise. Maybe it should be enough for her too. Maybe it would be if the world would just leave them alone long enough to find out. But Clara had learned young that the world didn't leave people alone. It came for them with papers and badges and good intentions that cut deeper than cruelty ever could. She closed her eyes and held Pearl tight. Outside, Silas set down his knife. He picked up the small shape he'd been working on, a bird wing spread caught mid-flight. He turned it in his hands, studying it. Then he walked quietly to the house, opened the door just enough, and set the bird on the kitchen table where Clara would find it in the morning. He went back to the porch and sat down, and the night folded around him like an old blanket. Tomorrow there would be more work, more silence, more careful, uncertain steps towards something he was afraid to name, because naming it meant it could be lost. But tonight, for the first time in 4 years, the ranch didn't feel empty, and that he reckoned was a start. Clara found the bird on the kitchen table before Silas was awake. She picked it up and turned it in her fingers. Wings spread, caught mid-flight, every feather carved with a patience that didn't match the man she'd watched hammer fence posts like he was punishing the wood. She set it on the crate beside Pearl's horse and said nothing about it at breakfast. Silas said nothing either. That was how things worked between them now. Gifts left without explanation, gratitude shown without words, a language built on silence and small acts. 3 weeks passed that way. The rhythm held. Chores at dawn, work through the heat, quiet suppers, evenings on the porch. Ruth came twice a week as promised, bringing food and fabric and a warmth that filled the house differently than Silas's steady presence. She taught Clara to make biscuits that didn't taste like sawdust, and showed her how to hem a dress so it hung straight. Pearl followed Ruth around like a duckling, asking questions that never stopped. Ruth, why do chickens eat rocks? Ruth, can horses swim? Ruth, do you think Silas is lonely? That last one stopped Ruth mid-stitch. She looked at Pearl, then at Clara, then out the window where Silas was working the corral gate. I think he was, Ruth said carefully, before you two came. He's not now, Pearl said with the absolute certainty of a 4-year-old. He has us. Ruth smiled, but Clara saw something in her eyes, a flicker of worry that didn't match the warmth. She filed it away and kept sewing. The trouble started on a Tuesday. Clara was hauling water from the well when she heard hooves. 2 riders coming from the south road, moving at a clip that said, "Business not visiting." She set the bucket down and shaded her eyes. Sheriff Dalton. She recognized his silver badge catching the sun, and beside him, a younger man in a pressed suit carrying a leather satchel. Pierce, the county man. She'd heard Silas mention the name to Ruth. Silas came out of the barn before Clara could call for him. He saw the riders, and his whole body changed. Shoulders squared, jaw locked. Hands that had been loose at his sides curled slowly into fists, then forced themselves open again. "Go inside," he said without looking at her. "Take Pearl." Silas. "Now Clara." She grabbed Pearl from the garden and went. But she pressed herself against the window and watched her heart beating so hard she could hear it in her ears. Dalton dismounted with a grunt. Pierce stayed on his horse a moment longer, surveying the property with the careful eyes of a man taking inventory. "Mr. Calhoun?" Dalton touched his hat brim. "This is Mr. Pierce from the county welfare office." "I know who he is. What do you want?" Pierce dismounted and opened his satchel. "We're here regarding the 2 minor children in your custody. There have been formal complaints filed with the county expressing concern about their welfare." "Complaints from who?" "Mrs. Dorothy Pike, Mrs. Agatha Caldwell, and 26 other residents of Dusty Creek who've signed a petition requesting the county investigate your fitness as a guardian." 26. Clara felt the number like a punch. 26 people in town thought Silas shouldn't have them. Silas's voice stayed level, but Clara could hear the strain underneath. "I bought those girls legal, paid cash at a county-sanctioned auction." "The transaction was legitimate," Pierce said, pulling out a folder. "But the arrangement itself is under review. The county has a duty to ensure children are housed in appropriate environments. A single man with no family, no wife, no female presence. Ruth Marsh comes by twice a week. A neighbor's occasional visit doesn't constitute proper feminine supervision, Mr. Calhoun." Dalton shifted his weight. "Silas, we need to come inside. Look around. Talk to the girls." Silas didn't move for 3 full seconds. Clara counted them. "Fine," he said. "Look at whatever you want." They came inside. Clara stepped back from the window, pulling Pearl behind her. Pearl gripped her leg, sensing the shift in the air, the way small animals sensed a storm. "Clara," Pearl whispered. "What's happening?" "Shh, just stay with me." Pierce walked through the house, slowly opening every door, checking every corner. He spent a long time in their room, looking at the bed, the blanket, the crate with the dresses Ruth had brought, the carved bird and horse on the shelf. He wrote in his notebook the entire time. Dalton crouched in front of Clara. His face was kind, but kindness from a man with a badge meant nothing when he had the power to take everything away. "Clara." "Right, I'm Sheriff Dalton." "I know who you are." "How old are you, sweetheart?" 9, and she's 4. "Do you like living here?" Clara looked past Dalton at Silas, who stood near the door with his arms crossed, his face a mask. He gave her the smallest nod. "Yes, sir. We like it here." "Has Mr. Calhoun been good to you?" "He feeds us, gave us a room, doesn't yell, doesn't hit, said I could go to school." "Has he ever?" "No." Clara cut him off, her voice harder than she intended. "Whatever you're about to ask, the answer is no. He's a good man. He's the only person who kept us together." Dalton studied her for a moment, then stood and turned to Pierce. "Well," Pierce closed his notebook. "The conditions are adequate, sparse but clean, no visible signs of neglect." He paused. "However, the petition raises legitimate concerns. I'll need to file a report and recommend a formal review." "A review," Silas said. "Meaning what?" "Meaning the county will schedule a hearing to determine whether the current arrangement should continue. In the meantime, you're expected to maintain these conditions and make no attempt to relocate the children." "I'm not going anywhere." "See that you don't." Pierce tucked his folder under his arm. "We'll be in touch." They left. Clara watched them ride away until they were just dust on the road. Silas stood on the porch, both hands on the railing, his head bowed. He stayed like that for a long time. "They're going to try to take us," Clara said from the doorway. "They're going to try. Mrs. Pike, Mrs. Caldwell, they're behind this. I know. What do we do? He lifted his head and looked at her. The exhaustion in his face made him look 10 years older than he was. We do what we've been doing. Keep the house clean. Keep you fed. Show them they're wrong. And if that's not enough, it has to be enough. But it wasn't. Not for Dusty Creek. The visits came faster after that. Pierce alone the following week, poking through the house, asking Clara the same questions in different ways. Did Silas drink? Did he have visitors? Did he leave them alone? Each question felt like a trap. Each answer weighed and measured for ammunition. Then Mrs. Caldwell came, not with the sheriff alone. She walked up to the ranch in her black dress like she owned the ground she stood on and knocked on the door while Silas was in the far pasture checking cattle. Clara opened it. Mrs. Caldwell looked down at her with those cold gray eyes, and Clara felt 9 years old shrink to 5. Clara Jane. Mrs. Caldwell. I've come to see how you're getting on. We're fine. May I come in? Clara wanted to say no. Every nerve in her body screamed no. But she'd learned from Silas that refusing authority only gave them reasons to push harder. She stepped aside. Mrs. Caldwell walked through the house the way Pierce had, inspecting, evaluating, but her eyes lingered on different things. The single blanket on the bed, the wooden crate for a shelf, the lack of curtains on the windows. This is where you sleep? Yes, ma'am. Both of you. In this room. Pearl and me, yes. And Mr. Calhoun sleeps where? In the other room, on the other side of the house. Mrs. Caldwell made a sound in her throat. Not quite disapproval, not quite satisfaction. She turned and looked at Clara. Do you know why I'm here? To take us back. To ensure your welfare. There's a difference. There isn't. Not from where I'm standing. Mrs. Caldwell's mouth thinned. You've always been difficult, Clara. Even at the facility. I've always been honest. You just didn't like what I had to say. What you need is structure, discipline, a proper home with a woman's guidance. Not this. She gestured at the small room. Not living with a man who has no business raising children. Clara's fists clenched at her sides. He has more business raising us than you ever did. You sold us, Mrs. Caldwell. You put us on that platform and let people bid on us like animals. Don't stand in this house and tell me you care about our welfare. Mrs. Caldwell's face went rigid. I did what the county required. The county required you to sell a 4-year-old. The county required me to place children in homes. That's what I do. You didn't place us. You auctioned us. And when Mrs. Pike wanted to split us up, you didn't say a word. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Mrs. Caldwell straightened her spine, adjusted her collar, and walked toward the door. I'll include my observations in my report. The hearing will determine what happens next. She left without saying goodbye. Clara stood in the middle of the room shaking, and realized she was crying, not from sadness, from rage. Silas found her that way when he came back. He took one look at her face and said, Who was here? Mrs. Caldwell. His jaw worked. What did she say? That we need a proper home. That you have no business raising us. What did you say? That she sold us like animals and doesn't get to pretend she cares. Silas was quiet for a beat. Then he said, Good. Clara wiped her face. She's going to use it against us. Probably. I shouldn't have said it. You said the truth. Don't apologize for that. But the truth Clara was learning didn't protect you the way it should. The truth was just words, and words meant nothing against papers and petitions and 26 signatures. The hearing was set for August 12th. Silas got the notice by courier on a Monday morning, a single sheet of paper that he read standing on the porch, his face going stone still. Clara watched him from the doorway. When? 2 weeks. What happens if we lose? We don't lose. But if we do, he folded the paper and put it in his pocket. If we do, they take you back to Mrs. Caldwell's facility, and from there, they place you wherever they decide, together or separate. They'll separate us. That's what they'll try. Clara felt the ground shift under her feet. Everything they'd built, the routine, the trust, the careful, fragile sense of belonging, all of it balanced on a hearing 2 weeks away. Decided by people who'd never spent a single night in this house, never watched Silas carve a wooden horse by lamplight, never heard Pearl laugh at chickens or call a beetle her friend. The next 12 days passed in a fever of preparation. Silas took them to town on Sunday, made sure they sat in church where everyone could see them. Clara wore the best dress Ruth had given her. Pearl's hair was braided with the yellow ribbon. Silas wore a clean shirt and sat with his hat in his lap, enduring the stares and whispers, like a man enduring bad weather, resigned but unbroken. Ruth came more often. She brought Mrs. Colby from the church, a gentle woman who prayed with them and brought preserves, and asked Pearl about her chickens. They were building evidence. Character witnesses. Proof that Silas wasn't what the petition claimed. Toby Marsh came by the day before the hearing. Clara was surprised to see him. He stood by the corral with Silas, the two men talking in low voices. "I'll speak for you," Toby said. "At the hearing." Silas looked at him. "You said you had doubts." "I did. Ruth set me straight." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I've watched those girls these past weeks, Silas. The older one's got fire in her. The little one laughs like she's never been hurt. Kids don't do that in bad homes. The county doesn't see it that way. The county's wrong, and I'll say so to whatever judge they put in front of me." Silas extended his hand. Toby took it. They shook once, firm and brief, and something settled between them that hadn't been there before. Not friendship exactly, but alliance. Then morning came, August 12th. Clara woke before the knock. She lay in the dark with Pearl breathing beside her and tried to convince her body to move. Her legs felt like iron. Her chest felt like someone had filled it with wet sand. Clara. Pearl was awake, watching her with those big brown eyes. "Time to get up, honey." "Is today the day?" "Yeah, today's the day." Pearl reached for her blue cloth and held it tight. "I don't want to go back to Mrs. Caldwell." "You won't." "Promise." Clara swallowed the lie that wanted to come out. She couldn't promise. She didn't know. All she had was hope and Silas and the desperate belief that someone in that courtroom would see what she saw, that this was home. "I'll do everything I can," she said instead. Pearl nodded. It wasn't enough, and they both knew it. Silas had breakfast waiting. Eggs, biscuits, strong coffee for himself, milk for them. His face was calm, but Clara noticed his hands. The way they gripped his coffee cup, just a little too tight. The way his thumb ran back and forth across the handle, like he was trying to wear a groove in it. "Eat," he said. "All of it." They ate. Nobody spoke. The scrape of forks on tin filled the silence. When they finished, Silas knelt in front of Pearl. "Today's going to be long and boring. Lot of talking. Lot of grown-ups saying things that don't make sense. But I need you to sit still and be patient. Can you do that?" Pearl nodded. "Good girl." He touched her cheek, just his thumb light and quick, then stood and looked at Clara. "Whatever happens in that room, you tell the truth. Don't try to make me look good. Don't try to protect me. Just say what's real. What if the truth isn't enough? Then we deal with that when it comes. But we don't start by lying." Hooves outside. Sheriff Dalton right on time. Clara's stomach flipped. Silas squeezed her shoulder once. "Ready?" "No." "Me neither. Let's go." They stepped outside into a morning already thick with heat. Dalton was waiting with his wagon. Silas helped Pearl up, then Clara, then climbed up beside them. Nobody spoke on the ride to town. Dusty Creek had never felt so hostile. People lined the boardwalks watching them pass. Mrs. Pike stood in front of her shop arms, crossed face satisfied. A cluster of women near the church whispered and pointed. 2 ranchers by the saloon shook their heads. Clara kept her eyes forward. Pearl pressed into her side. Silas drove like the town didn't exist. The courthouse was small and hot. Pierce was already there, folder open, pen ready. Mrs. Caldwell sat in the front row in her black dress, her hands folded, her face a mask of righteous certainty. Mrs. Pike sat beside her, rigid with expensive indignation, and behind the bench sat Judge Ephraim Morse, white-haired, sharp-eyed, his black robe making him look like a crow perched over carrion. He watched them enter with an expression that gave nothing away. Silas guided them to a bench. Pearl climbed into Clara's lap. Toby and Ruth Marsh slipped in behind them. Mrs. Colby sat near the back, her Bible in her hands. Morse rapped his gavel. This hearing is called to order. We are here to determine the custody arrangement for Clara Jane Brennan and Pearl Brennan, currently in the care of Silas Ridge Calhoun. Mr. Pierce, present the county's position. Pierce stood. His voice was measured and bloodless, each word placed like a brick in a wall. Your Honor, the county has received a petition signed by 26 residents expressing concern about the welfare of 2 minor girls living with an unmarried man in isolated conditions. Mr. Calhoun has no family, no wife, no formal experience with child rearing. The children live in Spartan conditions, with limited social interaction, limited educational opportunity, and no proper feminine guidance. Additionally, Mrs. Caldwell, who has 12 years' experience managing the county facility, has filed a formal objection to the arrangement. Morse nodded. Mrs. Caldwell, you wish to speak. Mrs. Caldwell stood smoothing her dress. Your Honor, I've dedicated my life to the welfare of orphaned children. In all my years, I've never seen an arrangement so clearly unsuitable. These girls need structure. They need discipline. They need a woman's hand. Mr. Calhoun, whatever his intentions, cannot provide what these children require. And in your facility, they'd receive that. They'd receive proper care, moral instruction, and preparation for useful lives. Morse's face didn't change. Mrs. Pike, I understand you also wish to address the court. Mrs. Pike stood with the stiff posture of a woman used to being obeyed. Your Honor, I offered to take the older girl at the auction. I could have given her a trade, a future, a respectable home. Mr. Calhoun outbid me and has since kept both children isolated on his property. It's unseemly, improper, and potentially dangerous. You offered to take only the older child, is that correct? The younger one is too small to be useful. Morse made a note. His pen moved slowly, deliberately. Mr. Calhoun, you may respond. Silas stood. Clara could see the tension in his back, the way he held himself like a man walking into a fight he wasn't sure he could win. Everything they said about me is true. I'm not married. I don't have family. I've never raised children before. He paused. But everything they said about those girls is wrong. They're not neglected. They're not in danger. They're fed, sheltered, and cared for. The older one's reading again because I arranged a teacher to come 3 times a week. The little one's healthy and growing. Neither one of them is afraid to sleep at night. The county argues you can't provide feminine guidance, Morse said. Ruth Marsh comes twice a week. Mrs. Colby from the church visits regular. Those girls have women in their lives. They just also have a roof over their heads and a man who won't let anyone split them apart. Mrs. Pike claims the arrangement is improper. Mrs. Pike wanted to buy a 9-year-old to work in her dress shop and leave her 4-year-old sister to the county. That's what she calls proper. Murmurs in the courtroom. Mrs. Pike's face went white. Morse raised his hand for silence. I'd like to hear from the children. Clara, please stand. Clara set Pearl on the bench and stood. Her legs shook. Every eye in the room landed on her. Clara, do you feel safe with Mr. Calhoun? Yes, sir. Has he ever hurt you or your sister? No, sir, never. Tell me about your daily life on the ranch. Clara took a breath. We wake up early, feed the chickens, do chores. He's teaching me how to mend fences and haul water and keep a garden. Miss Warren comes 3 times a week for school lessons. Ruth Marsh teaches me cooking and sewing. Pearl plays and helps where she can. We eat together. He reads to us at night sometimes. And you want to stay? More than anything, sir. Why? Clara felt the words rising up from somewhere deeper than thought. Because he's the only person who ever cared that Pearl and I stay together. When Mrs. Pike wanted just me, he paid for both of us. When Mrs. Caldwell put us on that auction block, he was the only one who stepped forward. He doesn't yell, he doesn't grab. He eats on the porch so we feel safe. He carved Pearl a horse when a snake bit her hand. He told me I could go to school. Her voice cracked. She pushed through it. He's not our father. He's not our blood. But he treats us like we matter. And nobody else ever has. The courtroom went silent. Morse looked at her for a long time. Thank you, Clara. Pearl, can you come here? Pearl slid off the bench and walked forward, clutching her blue cloth. She was so small she barely reached the judge's desk. Morse leaned forward. Pearl, do you know who I am? You're the judge. That's right. Can you tell me, do you like living with Mr. Calhoun? Pearl nodded. Can you tell me why? Pearl thought about it. Then she said in her clear, small voice, He made me a horse, and he said I wouldn't die from the snake, and he doesn't take Clara away. Morse's pen had stopped moving. He stared at Pearl for a moment that stretched like taffy. Then Toby Marsh stood up in the back. Your Honor, may I speak? Morse raised an eyebrow. And you are? Tobias Marsh. I ranch 3 miles south of Silas Calhoun. I've known him 6 years. Go ahead. I'll be straight with you, Judge. When I heard Silas bought those girls, I had the same doubts everyone else did. Rode over there to see for myself. Asked him hard questions. Looked him in the eye. Toby paused. His voice was rough but steady. What I found was a clean house, 2 fed children, and a man who eats his supper on the porch so those girls don't have to be afraid of him. My wife Ruth's been going over there twice a week. She says those girls are healing. She says Silas is healing too. And I believe her because Ruth doesn't lie and she doesn't exaggerate. He looked at Mrs. Caldwell. That woman put them on an auction block. This man gave them a home. If the county can't tell the difference, then the county's broken. The courtroom erupted. Morse hammered his gavel. Mrs. Pike was on her feet protesting. Mrs. Caldwell's face had gone from rigid to rattled. Pierce was scribbling furiously. When the noise died, Morse spoke slowly. I've heard testimony from both sides. The county raises valid concerns about an unconventional arrangement. However, I've also heard compelling evidence that these children are adequately cared for and strongly opposed to removal. He paused. Clara stopped breathing. I'm not prepared to make a final ruling today. The court grants temporary custody to Mr. Calhoun, subject to monthly inspections, and the following conditions: continued education, regular contact with female mentors, and a formal review in 6 months. If at that time conditions remain satisfactory, custody will be made permanent. Clara's knees buckled. Silas caught her arm. However, Morse continued, his voice hardening. If at any point the county finds evidence of neglect, mistreatment, or failure to meet these conditions, custody will be revoked immediately. Am I clear, Mr. Calhoun? Yes, Your Honor. This hearing is adjourned. The gavel fell. Clara turned and threw her arms around Silas's waist before she could think about it. He stiffened, then his hand came down on her back, heavy, awkward reel. Pearl grabbed his leg. Can we go home now? Silas looked down at them, and Clara saw something break open in his face. Not a smile. Something bigger than a smile. Something that had been locked behind 4 years of grief and solitude, and had finally cracked through. Yeah, he said, his voice rough. Let's go home. Mrs. Caldwell passed them in the aisle. She stopped, looked at Silas and said, 6 months, Mr. Calhoun. That's all you have. Silas met her eyes. 6 months is plenty. Mrs. Pike didn't speak. She walked out with her chin high and her fury barely contained, and Clara watched her go with a satisfaction that tasted like cold water after a long drought. Outside, the sun hit them like a wall. Toby and Ruth were waiting by the wagon. Ruth pulled Clara into a hug that smelled like flower and lavender. "You did so good, honey." "Is it over?" Ruth looked at Silas over Clara's head. Their eyes met, and something passed between them that Clara couldn't read. "It started," Ruth said quietly. "You've got 6 months to finish it." Silas lifted Pearl into the wagon, helped Clara up, and climbed onto the bench. He took the reins, and the horses moved forward. Dusty Creek fell away behind them. Pearl fell asleep against Clara's side before they'd gone a mile. Clara leaned into Silas's solid shoulder and felt the rocking of the wagon in her bones. "Silas." "Yeah." "Thank you for not giving up." His hand left the reins long enough to squeeze her shoulder once. "Thank you for telling the truth." They rode north in silence, the summer heat pressing down the road, stretching ahead toward a ranch that was starting to feel less like a stranger's house and more like the only place in the world where Clara Jane Brennan could breathe without fear. 6 months. That's what they had. 6 months to prove that what they were building was strong enough to survive everything the county and Mrs. Caldwell and Mrs. Pike could throw at it. Clara closed her eyes and held Pearl tight. 6 months. She'd make every single day count. The first inspection came 9 days after the hearing. Pierce rode in alone on a Wednesday morning while Clara was teaching Pearl her letters at the kitchen table. Silas met him in the yard and let him walk through the house without argument, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed while Pierce opened cupboards, checked the water supply, and wrote in his notebook. "The teacher's still coming?" Pierce asked, not looking up. "3 times a week. Miss Adelaide Warren. You can speak with her if you want." "I will." Pierce glanced at the table where Pearl's slate showed a wobbly letter P. "The younger one's learning too." "She's 4. She's learning what a 4-year-old learns." Pierce made a note, closed his notebook, and left. He didn't say if things were satisfactory. He didn't say if they weren't. He just rode away, and Silas stood on the porch watching him go with the look of a man counting bullets before a fight. Clara came out and stood beside him. "Well, he didn't say we failed. He didn't say we passed either. That's how it works with these people. They don't tell you where you stand until they're ready to knock you down." September burned hot and dry. The creek behind the ranch dropped to a trickle, and Silas hauled water twice a day for the animals. Clara helped without being asked, her arms growing stronger, her hands toughening into something that didn't blister anymore. Pearl tagged along carrying a cup of water, as her contribution spilling half of it on the walk back and not caring. Ruth kept coming. Tuesdays and Fridays reliable as sunrise. She taught Clara to can vegetables from the garden, to mend clothes, so the stitches didn't show, to make a stew from almost nothing that tasted like something. She brought news from town too, and not all of it was good. "Mrs. Pike's been talking to the churchwomen," Ruth said one Tuesday, her voice low while Pearl napped in the other room. "Saying Silas is unfit. Saying it's only a matter of time before the county sees sense." "Let her talk," Silas said from the porch. Ruth looked at Clara. "She's not just talking, Silas. She's organizing. Got a group of women who've written to the territorial governor asking for new regulations on single men adopting children." Silas's hands stilled on the harness he was oiling. "The governor. I don't know if it'll go anywhere, but she's making noise. And noise has a way of reaching the wrong ears." Clara felt the familiar tightening in her chest. Every time things settled, every time she started to believe they might be safe, something reached in and shook the ground. "What do we do?" she asked. Ruth put her hand on Clara's arm. "You keep doing what you're doing. You keep being healthy and happy and learning. That's the best argument you've got." But arguments Clara was learning didn't always win against money and influence, and Mrs. Pike had both. October brought the second inspection. This time Dalton came with Pierce and they stayed longer. Dalton spoke with Clara alone in the bedroom, while Pierce grilled Silas at the kitchen table. The questions were the same, reworded and rearranged, probing for cracks. Does Mr. Calhoun ever leave you alone overnight? No, sir. Does he drink? I've never seen him drunk. Does he ever lose his temper? Clara thought about the day she'd touched the cradle, the sharpness in his voice, the way he'd snapped and walked away. He gets quiet when he's upset, she said carefully. But he doesn't yell and he doesn't hit. Quiet how? He goes to the barn and works until he feels better. Then he comes back. Dalton wrote something down. Clara couldn't see what it was, and the not knowing ate at her. When they left, Silas sat at the table and stared at the wall for a long time. Clara washed dishes. The silence between them wasn't comfortable this time. It was loaded. They asked about the cradle, Silas said suddenly. Clara's hands went still in the basin. Pierce saw it in the barn. Asked what it was. I told him. What did he say? Nothing. He just wrote it down. Silas rubbed his face with both hands. They're looking for something wrong, Clara. Every visit, every question, they're not checking on you. They're building a case. Then we give them nothing to build with. I don't know if that's enough anymore. It has to be. He looked at her across the table, and she saw something she'd never seen in him before. Defeat creeping in around the edges like water finding cracks in a foundation. Silas, don't. Don't what? Don't give up. You told me we'd fight. You said we'd show them they were wrong. I know what I said. Then mean it. His eyes sharpened. The defeat pulled back, replaced by something harder. I mean it. Good, because Pearl called you Papa yesterday when she was talking to the chickens, and if you let them take us now, it'll break her. Silas flinched. Actually flinched, like she'd hit him. She called me what? Papa. She was telling Biscuit that her papa makes the best eggs. I don't think she even knows she said it. Silas stared at her. His throat worked. He opened his mouth, closed it, and turned away. I'll be in the barn. He said, his voice rough. He was gone 3 hours. When he came back, his eyes were red, but his jaw was set like granite. He sat down across from Clara and said, All right, here's what we're going to do. They worked harder after that. Silas fixed everything on the ranch that could be fixed. The leaning barn got new supports. The chicken coop got fresh wire. The garden got a proper fence. He built a shelf for Clara's school books and put a curtain on the bedroom window that Ruth helped him sew. Small things, but the kind of things an inspector would notice. Clara threw herself into her lessons. Miss Warren brought harder books, and Clara devoured them. Reading arithmetic, geography, history. She learned to write in a clear hand and to do sums in her head. When Pierce came for the November inspection, she showed him her work, without being asked, slate after slate of neat figures and careful sentences. Pierce looked at them, looked at Clara, made his notes. She's progressing well, he said to Silas, and it was the first positive thing he'd ever said in their house. But November also brought the letter. Silas found it in the mailbox on a cold Tuesday morning, a single-page official seal from the territorial governor's office. He read it standing by the road, and Clara watched his face go white. What is it? He handed it to her without a word. The letter was from a clerk in the governor's office acknowledging receipt of a petition from concerned citizens of Dusty Creek regarding the placement of minor children with unmarried men. The governor's office was reviewing the matter and would communicate further guidance to the local judiciary. Clara's hands shook. Mrs. Pike! She went over the judge's head. Can she do that? She just did. They stood there in the cold morning, the letter between them, and Clara felt something she hadn't felt since the auction block. The terrifying certainty that forces bigger than them were moving, and no amount of clean houses or good grades or wooden horses could stop them. Silas took the letter back and folded it into his pocket. Don't tell Pearl. What are you going to do? I'm going to town. Stay here with Pearl. Ruth's coming this afternoon. Silas, I need to talk to Judge Morse, man to man. He saddled his horse and rode out before Clara could argue. She watched him go, then went inside where Pearl was playing with her wooden animals on the kitchen floor. Where's Silas going? Pearl asked. Town. He'll be back. Can I have a biscuit? After lunch. Clara. Yeah. Is something bad happening? Clara looked at her sister, 4 years old and already reading the air for danger. No child should have to do that. No child should be so practiced at it. Nothing we can't handle, Clara said, and hated that she wasn't sure it was true. Silas came back at dusk. His face was unreadable, but something about the way he moved faster, sharper, told Clara the meeting had gone somewhere unexpected. She waited until Pearl was asleep before asking. They sat on the porch, the cold pressing in breath coming in small white clouds. Morse knows about the governor's letter, Silas said. Got one himself. And he's not happy. Said Mrs. Pike's petition went around proper channels. Said it puts him in a difficult position. Clara's stomach dropped. He's going to take their side. No, he said something else. Silas turned to look at her. He said the best way to make this go away is to make it official. Not just custody, adoption. Adoption. Full legal adoption. Papers filed with the territorial court. Makes you my daughters under the law, not just wards. Once that's done, the governor's got nothing to review. You'd be mine. Same as if you were born to me. Clara's breath caught. Can you do that? Morse says yes. There's a process. Takes time. He'd have to approve it, and the county would have to sign off. But if we can get through the 6-month review with clean marks, he'll push it through. When's the review? February. 4 months. 4 months. Clara counted them in her head like coins. October was nearly done. November, December, January, February. 4 months of inspections and questions, and Mrs. Pike's shadow hanging over everything. What if Mrs. Pike finds out? She will. Can't keep something like that quiet in a town this small. What will she do? Silas was quiet for a moment. Whatever she does, we'll handle it. You keep saying that. Because it keeps being true. Clara wanted to believe him. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and stared into the darkness. Silas? Yeah. Pearl called you Papa again today. To my face this time. He went still. She asked me if you were her papa now, and I said I didn't know. She said you were because you made her a horse, and you keep your promises. Clara paused. She wants to know if it's okay to call you that. The silence stretched. She heard him swallow hard. It's okay, he said, and his voice broke on the second word. Clara leaned into his shoulder, and he let her stay there. Two people sitting in the cold, holding on to something so fragile and so fierce it hurt to breathe around it. December hit hard. Snow came early and heavy, burying the ranch in white, isolating them from town for days at a time. Miss Warren couldn't make her visits, so Silas taught Clara what he could: basic arithmetic from ledger-keeping, geography from a worn atlas he'd carried since his army days. Pearl got sick the second week. A cough that started small and grew until it rattled in her chest like stones in a tin can. Clara sat up with her for 2 nights, pressing cool cloths to her forehead, singing the songs their mother used to sing. On the 3rd morning, Pearl's fever spiked. Her breathing went shallow and fast, and her eyes had a glassy look that made Clara's blood run cold. Silas. He was beside them in seconds. He put his hand on Pearl's forehead, and his face went tight. I'm riding for the doctor. It's snowing. I know. You can't ride in this. Watch me. He was out the door before Clara could argue, and she heard the barn door slam, heard the horse's whinny of protest, heard hooves pounding into the snow. Then silence. Just Pearl's ragged breathing and the wind against the walls. Clara pulled Pearl into her lap and held her. Stay with me, Pearl. Don't you leave me. Pearl's fingers found the blue cloth and held on. Mama, she whispered, her eyes unfocused. It's Clara, honey. I'm right here. I want Mama. I know you do. Is she coming? Clara pressed her face into Pearl's hot hair and fought back the sob that wanted to tear out of her. She's watching, Pearl. She's always watching. 3 hours. Silas was gone 3 hours in a blizzard, and Clara spent every minute of it bargaining with God, with the universe, with anyone who might be listening. Take anything. Take the ranch, take the custody, take everything. Just don't take Pearl. The door burst open with a blast of cold air. Silas stumbled in snow-covered, half-frozen, dragging a bearded man behind him. Dr. Harlan, smelling of whiskey and carbolic acid, his medical bag clutched in blue-tinged fingers. The doctor examined Pearl, while Clara gripped Silas's arm so hard her nails left marks through his shirt. He listened to Pearl's chest, checked her throat, felt her pulse. "Croup," he said. "Bad, but not the worst I've seen. Steam and fluids. Keep her warm. If the fever doesn't break by tomorrow, send for me again." "She'll live." Clara's voice was barely a sound. "She'll live. Kids are tougher than they look." Silas paid the doctor and walked him to the door. When he came back, Clara was crying hard, ugly sobs that shook her whole body. He stood there for a moment, uncertain, then sat down beside her and put his arm around her shoulders. "She's going to be okay," he said. "I can't lose her. She's all I have." "She's not all you have. Not anymore." Clara looked up at him through her tears. His face was raw from the cold, his lips cracked ice still melting in his eyebrows. He'd ridden through a blizzard for Pearl. 3 hours in killing weather because a 4-year-old girl who wasn't his blood was sick. "You could have died out there," she said. "Wasn't going to let her die in here." Pearl's fever broke that night. She opened her eyes, asked for water in a clear voice, and then said, "Papa, your face is red." Silas made a sound that was half laugh, half something else entirely. "Yeah, well, cold'll do that." "Did you ride in the snow?" "I did." "For me?" "For you." Pearl reached out and touched his cheek with her small, hot hand. "That was brave, Papa." Silas caught her hand and held it against his face. "Learned it from your sister." Clara watched them, and the last wall inside her, the one she'd built the day her mother died, the one that kept everyone at a distance, because distance meant you couldn't be hurt, cracked wide open and fell. January brought a thaw, then more snow, then another thaw. The world was mud and ice, and the slow gray promise of spring somewhere beyond the horizon. Miss Warren resumed her visits, and Clara attacked her studies with a ferocity that surprised even herself. "You're ready for more advanced work," Miss Warren said one afternoon, packing up her books. "When the weather clears, I'd like to bring you a proper grammar text. You could sit for an entrance examination at the Territorial Normal School in 2 or 3 years if you keep this pace." Clara stared at her. "A normal school, to be a teacher." "Why not? You've got the mind for it." Clara looked at Silas, who was oiling tack near the fire. He met her eyes without hesitation. "You want it, we'll make it happen." "You always say that." "Because I always mean it." The February review was set for the 14th, 2 weeks away. Pierce sent notice by courier, and Silas read it at the table with the same stone face he wore for every piece of official paper. "Same judge?" Clara asked. "Same judge, same courtroom. Dalton will come for us the morning of." "Is it going to be like last time?" "Worse, probably. Mrs. Pikes had 6 months to sharpen her knives." He was right. The week before the review, Ruth came with news that made Clara's hands go cold. "Mrs. Pike hired a lawyer." Ruth said, her voice tight. "Man from Cheyenne. Specializes in child welfare cases. He arrived in town 2 days ago." Silas set down his coffee cup very carefully. "A lawyer. Name's Whitfield. Sharp dresser, sharper tongue. He's been interviewing people in town, building a case." "What kind of case?" "The kind that says a single man with a dead wife and a cradle in his barn has no business raising 2 girls." The cradle. Clara felt the words like a knife between her ribs. They were going to use his grief against him. Use the worst thing that ever happened to him as proof that he was broken. Silas's face didn't change, but his hand on the coffee cup shook. Just once. just enough for Clara to see. "Let them bring their lawyer," he said. "Silas, you need a lawyer too." "Can't afford one." "Then I'll find you one." Ruth. "Don't argue with me, Silas Calhoun. You've been stubborn enough for 10 men, and it's gotten you this far. But you can't walk into that courtroom against a Cheyenne lawyer with nothing but your word and 2 little girls." Silas looked at her. Something passed between them, the kind of silent communication that happens between people who've known each other long enough to skip the surface and go straight to the bone. "Fine," he said. "Find me a lawyer." Ruth found one. Or rather, she found something better. She found Thomas Acker, a retired circuit judge who'd settled in Dusty Creek 3 years ago, grew vegetables, and hadn't practiced law in a decade. But when Ruth told him the story, he came to the ranch, sat at the kitchen table, and listened. He was 70 years old with a white beard and eyes that missed nothing. "Tell me everything," he said. So they did. Clara told him about the auction, about Mrs. Caldwell, about Mrs. Pike wanting only her. Silas told him about paying $60, about the cradle, about Mary and Thomas, about the county visits, and the governor's letter. Acker listened without interrupting. When they finished, he sat back and stroked his beard. "You've got a strong case on the merits. Children are healthy, educated, bonded to you. The problem isn't the facts. The problem is the optics." "Optics," Silas said. "How it looks. Single man, 2 girls, isolated ranch. Whitfield's going to play that for everything it's worth. He'll paint you as damaged, unstable, inappropriate. He'll use the cradle as evidence of unresolved grief. He'll argue that your attachment to these children is a substitute for the family you lost, not a healthy foundation for raising them." Clara's fists clenched under the table. "That's not true." "Doesn't have to be true. Just has to be convincing." Acker looked at Silas. "Here's what I need from you. Don't lose your temper. Don't get defensive. When Whitfield pushes, and he will push you, stay calm. You answer simply. You let the facts speak." "And if the facts aren't enough?" Acker smiled. It was thin and sharp, and held 30 years of courtroom battles behind it. "Then we use the one thing Whitfield doesn't have." "What's that?" "The truth. Told by a 9-year-old girl who's smarter than half the lawyers in Wyoming territory." He looked at Clara, and Clara felt the weight of everything settle on her shoulders. The hearing, the custody, the adoption, Silas's future, Pearl's future, all of it resting on what she said in a courtroom in 3 days. "Can you do it?" Acker asked. Clara thought about the auction block, thought about Mrs. Caldwell's cold hands, thought about Pearl's voice saying Papa and Silas riding through a blizzard, and the wooden bird on the kitchen table that first morning left without explanation. "Yes," she said, "I can do it." The night before the hearing, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark listening to Pearl breathe, counting the seconds between each exhale. Outside, the wind had died, and the night was so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat. She got up and went to the main room. Silas was there, sitting by the fire, staring at something in his hands. As she got closer, she saw what it was. The cradle. He'd brought it in from the barn. Clara stopped. Silas. He didn't look up. Couldn't sleep either. She sat down across from him. The cradle sat between them on the floor, smooth and perfect, built for a child who never came home. "They're going to ask about it tomorrow," she said. "I know." "What are you going to say?" He ran his hand along the rail the way she'd seen him do once before. Slow, careful, like he was touching something that hurt. "I'm going to tell them the truth. That I built it for my son. That he died before he ever lay in it. That I kept it because throwing it away felt like losing him again. And then..." He looked up at her. His eyes were wet, but his voice was steady. "And then I'm going to tell them what I should have done a long time ago. What I'm going to do tomorrow." "What?" Silas picked up the cradle and held it in his lap. "I'm going to tell them I built this for Thomas. and I'm going to tell them that Clara and Pearl are the reason I can finally put it down." Clara's tears came fast and silent. She didn't wipe them away. "You don't have to say that in front of everyone." "Yes, I do, because it's true. And because Acker was right, the truth is the only thing we've got that Whitfield can't argue with." He set the cradle on the floor between them. Then he reached across and took Clara's hand. His fingers were rough and warm and steady. "Whatever happens tomorrow, Clara, I need you to know something." "What?" "You saved me, you and Pearl. I was dying out here, not fast but steady, just running down like a clock with nobody to wind it. And then you stood on that auction block, and you said don't take her, and I remembered what it felt like to care about something enough to fight for it." Clara squeezed his hand so hard her fingers ached. "You saved us first." "Maybe we saved each other." Pearl's voice came from the bedroom doorway, sleepy and small. "Why is everybody crying?" Clara laughed through her tears. "Come here, Pearl." Pearl padded over in her nightdress, the blue cloth trailing from one hand, and climbed into Silas's lap. She looked at the cradle on the floor. "What's that?" Silas's arm tightened around her. "Something I made a long time ago, for someone I loved very much." "Where are they?" "In heaven." Pearl thought about that. "Mama's in heaven too." "I know, sweetheart." "Do you think they're friends, your someone and my mama?" Silas pressed his face into Pearl's hair. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "I think they are." Pearl nodded, satisfied. "Good. Then nobody's lonely." Clara watched Silas hold Pearl in the firelight, the cradle at his feet, the shadows shifting on the walls, and she understood something she'd been circling around for months. This wasn't just about custody or paperwork or what the county decided. This was about three broken people who'd found each other in the wreckage and built something worth fighting for. Tomorrow, a courtroom full of strangers would decide if that something was enough. Clara picked up the cradle and set it on the table beside her school books and Pearl's wooden horse and the carved bird that Silas had left without explanation on their first morning. "We're ready," she said. Silas looked at her over Pearl's sleeping head. "Yeah," he said. "We are." Morning came like a held breath. Clara dressed Pearl in the best dress Ruth had given them, braided her hair with the yellow ribbon, and tied it twice to make sure it held. Pearl stood still through all of it, watching Clara's face with those big brown eyes that saw too much for 4 years old. "Is today the day they decide?" Pearl asked. "Yes." "What if they say no?" Clara knelt and took Pearl's hands. "Then we fight again, and again, and again, until they run out of reasons to say no." "What if they never run out?" Clara pulled her close. "Then we make new reasons for yes." Silas was waiting in the main room. He'd shaved. Clara had never seen him without stubble, and the bare face made him look younger, raw or exposed in a way that made her chest ache. He wore a clean white shirt, and his only pair of pants without patches. His boots were polished. His hat was in his hands. On the table beside Clara's school books and Pearl's carved animals sat the cradle. Small, perfect, built for a boy named Thomas, who never drew breath. Silas saw Clara looking at it. "Acker said to bring it." "Are you sure?" "No, but I'm bringing it anyway." Hooves outside, Dalton's wagon. Clara's stomach flipped so hard she tasted bile. Silas picked up the cradle with one hand and Pearl with the other. He looked at Clara and said, "Whatever happens in that room, you remember what you are." "What am I?" "Brave." They walked out into a February morning that was cold enough to burn the lungs. Dalton was waiting, his expression careful and neutral. He looked at the cradle in Silas's hand but said nothing. Helped them into the wagon. Took the reins. Dusty Creek appeared through a thin fog, the buildings ghost like, the streets nearly empty. But the courthouse wasn't empty. Clara could see people gathered on the steps, more filing through the doors. Word had spread. The whole town had come to watch. Toby and Ruth were waiting by the entrance. Ruth pulled Clara into a hug and pressed her lips against her hair. You're going to be fine, honey. Toby gripped Silas's arm. We're right behind you. Inside the courtroom was packed. Every bench filled, people standing along the walls. Clara recognized faces: Mrs. Colby with her Bible, Miss Warren with her ink-stained hands, ranchers she'd seen at the general store, women from church who'd whispered and pointed for months. And in the front row, Mrs. Pike and Mrs. Caldwell sitting shoulder to shoulder, like twin pillars of judgment. Between them sat a man Clara had never seen, young, sharp-faced, wearing a suit so clean it looked like it had never touched dust. Wire-rimmed spectacles, a leather case on his lap. Whitfield, the Cheyenne lawyer. Clara's blood went cold. Silas guided them to their bench. Acker was already there, his white beard neat, his eyes calm with the stillness of a man who'd fought 100 battles and wasn't afraid of one more. He nodded at Silas, glanced at the cradle and said, "Good. Set it where the judge can see it." Silas placed the cradle on the floor beside the bench. Pearl looked at it, and then up at Silas. "Is that for Thomas?" The courtroom went quiet. People who'd been whispering stopped. Mrs. Pike's head turned. Silas crouched down. "Yeah, sweetheart. It was for Thomas. He's in heaven with Mama." "That's right." Pearl touched the cradle rail with one finger. "It's pretty Papa." The word Papa rippled through the courtroom like a stone dropped in still water. Clara saw Mrs. Caldwell's jaw tighten. Saw Whitfield lean forward making a note. Saw Judge Morse, entering from the side door, pause mid-stride. Morse took his seat. His face was harder than Clara remembered from the first hearing. Older. The lines deeper. The eyes sharper. He rapped his gavel once. "This court is in session. We are here for the 6-month review of custody for Clara Jane Brennan and Pearl Brennan, currently placed with Silas Ridge Calhoun. I'll note for the record that Mr. Calhoun has also filed a petition for full legal adoption." He looked at Whitfield. "I understand the respondents have retained counsel." Whitfield stood, smooth, confident, the kind of man who wore his competence like expensive cologne. "Your Honor, my name is James Whitfield, representing a coalition of concerned citizens led by Mrs. Dorothy Pike and Mrs. Agatha Caldwell. We respectfully challenge both the continuation of custody and the adoption petition." "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that Mr. Calhoun is psychologically unfit to serve as a guardian. That his attachment to these children stems from unresolved grief over the loss of his own family, creating an unhealthy dynamic that serves his emotional needs rather than the children's welfare." Clara's fists clenched in her lap. Beside her, Silas sat motionless. Acker put a hand on his arm. Morse nodded. "Present your case, Mr. Whitfield." Whitfield unbuttoned his jacket and began. He was good. Clara hated admitting it, but he was very good. He spoke without notes. His voice measured and persuasive, weaving facts and insinuations together so smoothly you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. "Your Honor, Mr. Calhoun lost his wife and infant son 4 years ago. Since that time, he has lived alone on an isolated ranch, withdrawn from community life, and by his own admission had no meaningful human connections until he purchased 2 children at a public auction." He paused, letting the word "purchased" hang in the air. "He keeps a cradle he built for his dead son in his barn. He has brought it to court today. I would ask the court to consider what that tells us about Mr. Calhoun's state of mind. This is not a man who has healed from his loss. This is a man who has replaced his loss with 2 substitute children, a dangerous psychological pattern that puts Clara and Pearl at risk." "Objection." Acker's voice was quiet, but it cut through Whitfield's rhythm like a blade. "Counsel is offering medical opinions without qualification. He's a lawyer, not a doctor." "Sustained," Morse said. "Mr. Whitfield, stick to the facts." "The facts, Your Honor, are these." Whitfield turned to the courtroom. "Mr. Calhoun has no income beyond subsistence ranching. He has no family support. He has no wife, no mother, no sister, no woman in his household to guide these girls through the challenges of growing up female. He lives in a house with 2 rooms and a kitchen. The girls sleep on a thin mattress with 1 blanket. Their wardrobe consists of hand-me-downs from a neighbor. He turned back to Morse. Is this the best we can offer 2 orphaned children? Is this the standard we set in Wyoming territory? A grieving hermit and a lean-to ranch. The courtroom buzzed. Clara felt each word like a splinter driven under her skin. She looked at Silas. His face was stone, but his hands in his lap were shaking. Acker stood. May I respond, Your Honor? Go ahead. Acker walked to the front of the courtroom with the unhurried pace of a man who'd forgotten how to be intimidated. He stopped, looked at Whitfield, then turned to the judge. Mr. Whitfield speaks well. He paints a convincing picture, but he left out a few details, so allow me to fill them in. He held up 1 finger. First, the auction. Mrs. Caldwell, who sits in this courtroom today as a concerned citizen, is the woman who placed these children on that platform. She is the one who allowed a 4-year-old girl to be bid on like livestock. She is the one who was prepared to sell them separately if the price was right. That's the standard of care she provided. That's what Mr. Calhoun rescued them from. Second finger. Mrs. Pike, who leads this coalition of concern, bid $30 for Clara and refused Pearl. She called a 4-year-old child, and I quote from the auction record, dead weight. She wanted a worker, not a daughter. That's her version of a proper home. Third finger. Mr. Calhoun paid $60 more than a month's wages for most men in this territory to keep 2 sisters together. He gave them a room with no lock on the door. He ate his meals on the porch so they wouldn't feel threatened by a man in their space. He arranged a teacher. He accepted help from Ruth Marsh. He rode through a December blizzard to fetch a doctor when Pearl fell ill. Acker turned to Whitfield. You say he's replacing his dead son with these children. I say he's a man who knows what loss feels like and chose to make sure 2 little girls didn't have to lose each other. There's a difference between damage and compassion, Mr. Whitfield. I'm sorry you can't see it. The courtroom erupted. Morse hammered for order. Clara's heart was slamming against her ribs so hard she could barely breathe. When the noise died, Whitfield stood again. Your Honor, the defense is making an emotional argument, not a legal one. And you're making a cold one, Acker shot back. The court gets to decide which one serves these children better. Morse raised his hand. Enough. Both of you. He looked at his papers. I'd like to hear from the children. Clara, please approach. Clara stood. Her legs felt like water, but she walked to the front of the courtroom and faced the judge. She could feel every eye in the room, could feel Mrs. Pike's hatred and Mrs. Caldwell's disapproval and Whitfield's calculating gaze. She could also feel Silas behind her, steady, present, the way he'd been every single day since he walked up to that auction platform and changed everything. Clara, Morse said, you've been living with Mr. Calhoun for 8 months now. I need you to tell me honestly, has this arrangement been good for you and your sister? Yes, sir. Mr. Whitfield suggests that Mr. Calhoun's grief makes him unsuitable. What do you say to that? Clara took a breath. She thought about what Acker had told her. Just tell the truth. Don't perform. Don't argue. Just say what's real. Silas lost his wife and his baby. He built that cradle with his own hands, and he's kept it for 4 years because throwing it away would feel like letting go of his son. I understand that because Pearl still carries a piece of our mother's dress everywhere she goes. It's not crazy. It's love. It's what you do when someone you love dies, and you don't know how to let go. Her voice steadied. Mr. Whitfield says Silas is replacing his son with us. That's wrong. He's not replacing anyone. He's making room. There's a difference. His son is still in his heart. We're there too now. That doesn't mean one pushed out the other. It means his heart got bigger. She paused. He eats on the porch because he wants us to feel safe. He carved Pearl a horse when she got bit by a snake. He rides through blizzards to fetch doctors. He promised me I could go to school, and he kept that promise. He doesn't yell. He doesn't hit. He doesn't grab. He's the first person since my mother who made me feel like I wasn't a burden." Her voice cracked. She pushed through. "You want to know if this arrangement is good for us?" Before Silas, Pearl wouldn't let go of my hand. She flinched when adults walked toward her. She asked me every night if someone was going to take her away. Now she names chickens and talks to horses and climbs into Silas's lap without being afraid. She calls him Papa. She chose that word herself. Nobody taught it to her. Clara looked directly at Whitfield. "You call him a grieving hermit. I call him the only father we've ever known. And if this court takes us away from him, you won't be protecting us. You'll be breaking us." Dead silence. Not a breath. Not a whisper. Not the creak of a bench. Judge Morse stared at her. His pen had stopped moving 3 sentences ago. "Thank you, Clara. Please sit down." Clara walked back to the bench on legs she couldn't feel. Silas's hand found her shoulder and squeezed so hard it almost hurt. She didn't mind. Morse turned to Pearl. "I'd like to speak with the younger child as well." Silas lifted Pearl and carried her to the front. She looked impossibly small standing before the judge's bench, her blue cloth in one hand, the yellow ribbon in her hair. "Pearl," Morse said gently, "do you remember me? You're the judge from before." "That's right. Pearl, do you like living with Mr. Calhoun?" "His name is Papa." A murmur in the courtroom. Morse's mouth twitched. "Do you like living with your papa?" "Yes. Can you tell me your favorite thing about living there?" Pearl thought about it, really thought the way children do when they take a question seriously. Then she said, "Nobody sells us there." The courtroom went absolutely still. Clara watched the words hit, watched Morse's face change, watched Mrs. Caldwell look down at her hands, watched Whitfield's confidence falter for the first time. "Nobody sells us there." 5 words from a 4-year-old that stripped away every legal argument and every procedural objection and laid bare the only truth that mattered. Morse cleared his throat. "Thank you, Pearl. You can go back to your seat." Silas carried Pearl back. His face was wet. He didn't wipe it. Morse looked at his papers for a long time. Then he said, "Mr. Calhoun, please approach." Silas stood. He walked to the front. He stood straight, hands at his sides, and met the judge's eyes. "Mr. Calhoun, I need to ask you about the cradle." Silas glanced at it sitting on the floor by the bench. "What about it? Why did you bring it today?" "Because it's part of the story, and I'm tired of hiding it." "What do you mean?" Silas turned to the courtroom. He didn't look at Whitfield or Mrs. Pike or Mrs. Caldwell. He looked at the people in the back rows, the ranchers and shop owners and ordinary folks who'd come to watch. "I built that cradle for my son Thomas. My wife Mary died bringing him into the world, and he died with her. Same night. I buried them both on a hillside behind my ranch, and I put that cradle in the barn, and I covered it with a blanket so I wouldn't have to look at it." His voice was steady. Raw, but steady. "For 4 years I worked that ranch alone. Didn't talk to anyone unless I had to. Didn't go to town unless I needed supplies. Didn't see the point in much of anything except getting through the day and going to sleep and getting through the next one." He paused. "Then I went to an auction to buy a plow, and instead I saw 2 girls being sold like cattle, and I heard the older one scream, 'Don't touch her! She's 4 years old!' And something inside me that had been dead for a long time woke up." He looked at the cradle. "I've kept that cradle for 4 years because I was afraid that letting go of it meant letting go of Thomas. But last night my daughter—" His voice broke on the word. He stopped, breathed, started again. "Last night Pearl touched it and said it was pretty. And she asked if Thomas and her mama were friends in heaven. And I realized that keeping that cradle in the dark wasn't honoring my son. It was hiding from my own grief." He picked up the cradle, held it in both hands. "So I'm done hiding. This cradle was built with love for a child I lost. The 2 girls sitting on that bench were found with the same love. Thomas isn't being replaced. He's being remembered. And if this court can't see the difference between a man who's broken and a man who's healing, then I don't know how to make it any plainer. He set the cradle on the judge's bench. I'm asking this court to let me adopt Clara and Pearl Calhoun. Not because I'm perfect, not because I have money or a wife or a big house, but because I love them, and they love me, and we're a family. And this cradle belongs to their brother. Their brother. Clara felt the words hit her like a wave. Pearl looked up at Silas with eyes so wide and full of wonder that it hurt to see. "Thomas is our brother," Pearl whispered. "Yeah, sweetheart, he is." The courtroom was in chaos. Women were crying. Men were clearing their throats. Mrs. Colby had her hands pressed together like she was praying. Even Dalton, standing by the door with his badge and his duty, was blinking hard. Whitfield stood. "Your Honor, this is emotionally manipulative theater. It doesn't address the fundamental—" "Sit down, Mr. Whitfield." Morse's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. Whitfield sat. Morse looked at the cradle on his bench. He ran his finger along the rail the same way Silas had done, the same way Clara had done months ago in the barn. "Mr. Pierce," Morse said, "your assessment." Pierce stood. He looked tired, like the last 8 months had worn something out of him that he couldn't get back. "Your Honor, I've conducted monthly inspections of Mr. Calhoun's property. The children are healthy, well-fed, receiving education, and demonstrate strong emotional bonds with their guardian. Mrs. Ruth Marsh provides regular feminine guidance. Miss Adelaide Warren reports that Clara is performing above grade level." He paused. "I have no grounds to recommend removal." Mrs. Caldwell. Mrs. Caldwell stood slowly. She opened her mouth, closed it. For the first time since Clara had known her, the woman seemed uncertain. "Your Honor, She stopped, looked at Pearl, who was sitting in Clara's lap holding her blue cloth. Looked at Clara, who stared back without flinching. "I have nothing further to add," Mrs. Caldwell said. She sat down. Mrs. Pike surged to her feet. "Your Honor, this is absurd. The law clearly states that custody decisions must serve the best interest of the child, Mrs. Pike. I'm aware of the statute. I wrote my thesis on it." Morse looked out at the courtroom. His gaze moved across every face, the supporters, the opponents, the curious, the indifferent. Then it settled on Clara. "Clara, I asked you once before where you wanted to live. I'm asking you again. With Silas. On the ranch. With Pearl. That's my home." "Pearl." Pearl's voice was clear and strong in the quiet room. "With Papa. Forever." Morse nodded. He picked up his pen and wrote for a long time. The scratch of the nib was the only sound. Clara counted her heartbeats. 11. 12. 13. Then Morse looked up. "I've reviewed the testimony, the inspection reports, the county records, and the statements of all parties. I've also reviewed the petition from Mrs. Pike's coalition and the correspondence from the governor's office." He paused. "The governor's office has deferred the matter to local judicial discretion. That means this decision is mine." Another pause. Clara gripped Pearl so tight the little girl squirmed. "It is the finding of this court that Silas Ridge Calhoun has met and exceeded every condition set forth in the original custody ruling. The children are healthy, educated, emotionally secure, and demonstrably bonded to their guardian. Furthermore, no alternative placement has been offered that would keep the sisters together, and removal would cause significant psychological harm." He looked at Silas. "The petition for full legal adoption is granted, effective immediately. Clara, Jane Brennan, and Pearl Brennan are hereby Clara Jane Calhoun and Pearl Calhoun, legal daughters of Silas Ridge Calhoun, with all rights and protections afforded under territorial law." The gavel came down once, hard, final. "This case is permanently closed." The courtroom exploded. Clara couldn't hear anything over the roaring in her ears. Pearl was screaming, "Papa!" and reaching for Silas. And Silas was lifting her, holding her, his face crumbling into something Clara had never seen joy so complete. It looked like pain. Ruth was crying. Toby was gripping the bench in front of him with both hands, his jaw working. Mrs. Colby had her eyes closed and her lips moving. Miss Warren was wiping her glasses with a handkerchief. Mrs. Caldwell stood and walked out of the courtroom without a word. She paused at the door, looked back once at Pearl laughing in Silas's arms, and something crossed her face that might have been regret. Then she was gone. Mrs. Pike didn't look back. She swept out with Whitfield trailing behind her, his leather case clutched against his chest. His confidence finally cracked. Clara stood in the middle of it all, unable to move. She felt Silas's hand on her shoulder, felt Pearl's fingers reaching for her, felt the world rearranging itself around a single impossible fact. She had a father. She had a name. She had a home that nobody could take away. Clara! Silas's voice cut through the noise. She looked up at him. His eyes were red, his cheeks wet, and he was holding Pearl against his chest, like she was the most precious thing in the world. Clara, come here. She stepped forward, and his free arm wrapped around her, pulling her in. Pearl's hand found her hair. Silas's chin rested on top of her head. 3 people standing in a courtroom holding each other while the world made noise around them. We did it, Clara whispered. You did it, Silas said. You and that mouth of yours. Clara laughed. Actually laughed loud and real, and Pearl laughed because Clara was laughing, and Silas made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob, and it was the most beautiful, messy, imperfect sound Clara had ever heard. Acker appeared beside them, his white beard spread in a wide smile. Congratulations, Mr. Calhoun. You've got yourself a family. Had one for a while, just took the law a minute to catch up. They walked out of the courthouse into a February afternoon that had turned bright and sharp. The crowd on the steps parted for them. Some people nodded. A few women smiled. A rancher Clara didn't know tipped his hat to Silas and said, "Well done." Silas nodded back. He didn't gloat, didn't celebrate. He just walked to the wagon with his daughters and helped them up the way he had that first day at the auction. His hand rough and steady, his face calm. But when he climbed up beside them and took the reins, Clara saw his hands shaking. Both of them, trembling like leaves. You okay? She asked. No, he said. I'm better than okay. I just don't have a word for it yet. Dusty Creek fell away. The road opened ahead, rutted and familiar. Pearl fell asleep against Clara's side before they'd gone 2 miles, her blue cloth in one hand, her wooden horse in the other. Clara leaned against Silas's shoulder. What happens now? She asked. Now we go home, feed the chickens, make supper. That's it. That's everything, Clara. That's the whole point. She thought about that. About how the biggest moments in life, the ones that changed everything, always led back to the smallest things. A meal at a table. A door without a lock. A wooden bird left without explanation. Silas? Yeah. When we get home, can you put the cradle in our room on the shelf next to Pearl's horse and my bird? He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was thick. Yeah, I can do that. Thomas should be with his sisters. Silas's arm came around her shoulders and pulled her close. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. They reached the ranch as the sun was dropping toward the mountains. Silas lifted Pearl down, still sleeping, and carried her inside. Clara followed, and the house that had felt so spare and bare 8 months ago now felt full, not with things, but with weight. The weight of belonging. Silas laid Pearl on the bed and tucked the blanket around her. He set the cradle on the shelf beside the horse and the bird, and for a moment he just stood there looking at them. Then he turned to Clara. I'm going to start supper. You want to help? Yeah, I want to help. They cooked together for the first time. Silas showed Clara how to fry bacon without burning it, how to crack eggs one-handed, how to make biscuits the way he'd learned from his mother 30 years ago. They worked side by side in the small kitchen, bumping elbows, trading instructions. And when Clara burned the first biscuit, Silas picked it up, looked at it, and said, "Chickens'll eat it." Ruth's biscuits don't burn. Ruth's had 30 years of practice. Give yourself time. Pearl woke to the smell of food and stumbled out, rubbing her eyes. She climbed onto her chair, looked at the plates on the table, 3 of them all at the table, not one on the porch, and said, "Papa, you're eating inside." Silas sat down. "Yeah, I'm eating inside." "How come?" "Because this is where my family eats." They ate together. 3 plates, 3 cups, 3 people at a table meant for 2. Silas's knee bumped the table leg. Pearl spilled her milk. Clara's biscuits were dense as river rocks. It was the best meal Clara had ever had. After supper, they sat on the porch. February cold pressed in, but Silas had brought blankets, and they huddled together watching the first stars appear. Pearl was in Silas's lap, her head against his chest. Clara sat beside them, her schoolbook closed on her knee. "Papa," Pearl said. "Yeah." "Tell us a story." "What kind?" "A true one." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Once there was a man who forgot how to live. He had a ranch and horses and a roof over his head, but he was empty inside, like a house with no fire in the hearth." Pearl snuggled closer. "What happened?" "One summer day he went to town to buy a plow. But instead he found 2 girls standing on a wooden platform, and the older one was holding the younger one so tight her arm shook. And everybody in that crowd was looking at those girls like they were something to be bought and used. But the older one, she was 9 years old, and she had fire in her eyes. She looked right back at all of them and said, 'Don't touch her.'" Clara felt tears running down her face. She didn't wipe them. "And the man thought, that's the bravest thing I've ever seen. And he thought, if a 9-year-old girl can stand up against a whole town, then maybe I can stand up against the thing that's been eating me alive for 4 years. So he paid everything he had, and he took those girls home, and they taught him something he'd forgotten." "What did they teach him?" Pearl whispered. "That a family isn't something you're born into. It's something you build, with your hands and your heart and your stubbornness. And that love isn't about blood or papers or what people think. It's about showing up, every day, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." "Is that the end?" "No, sweetheart, that's the beginning." Pearl's eyes drifted closed. Her breathing slowed. The blue cloth slipped from her fingers onto Silas's knee. Clara looked up at the sky. Stars everywhere, more than she could count, each one a point of light in the vast dark. She thought about her mother, and wondered if she was up there, wondered if Thomas was with her, wondered if they could see this porch and these 3 people, and this small, fierce, improbable family that had no business existing, but existed anyway. "Silas." "Yeah." "I'm glad you came to buy a plow that day." He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "I'm glad you held on to your sister." "I'll always hold on to her." "I know you will. And you'll always hold on to us." "Always. That's a promise." "You keep your promises." "I do." Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. Pearl breathed softly in his arms. The night wrapped around them, cold, vast, full of stars and silence, and the distant call of something wild. Inside the house, on a shelf in a small room, a cradle sat between a carved horse and a wooden bird. 3 gifts made by the same rough hands for 3 children who belonged to the same heart. The auction block was behind them. The courthouse was behind them. The fear, the running, the desperate bargaining with a world that dealt mostly in cruelty and indifference, all of it was behind them now. What lay ahead was uncertain. Life on a ranch in the Wyoming Territory didn't come with guarantees. There would be hard winters and dry summers and days when the work felt endless and the money felt short. There would be more Mrs. Pikes and more whispers and more people who looked at them sideways and saw something wrong instead of something brave. But there would also be mornings with eggs and burned biscuits, afternoons of school lessons and chicken feedings, evenings on this porch with stories and stars and the steady presence of a man who'd traded everything he had for the chance to be someone's father again. Clara closed her eyes and listened to the night. Wind through dry grass, horses shifting in the corral, Pearl's breathing, Silas's heartbeat under her ear. The whole world reduced to the sounds of safety and belonging. She was Clara Jane Calhoun. She had a sister named Pearl, and a brother named Thomas, and a father named Silas. She had a home with no locks on the doors, and a shelf full of wooden animals, and a future that included school and books, and maybe someday a classroom of her own. She had everything she needed. And it had started with 5 words shouted on an auction block on the hottest day of summer by a girl who refused to let go. "Don't touch her. She's 4. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.